Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining on this webinar. We're going to be covering testing protocols for runners, and I appreciate that you're here. As we go through the program, there we go. Slides are working. First of all, can you hear me? And if you could just go to the questions and just type in, someone please type in that you can hear me, and then we'll get going. Perfect, thank you very much. All right, so if you have questions, use that little question box there. I will probably defer answering questions till the end of the webinar. If I see something that's really pertinent, like I'm screwing up on what I'm saying in a slide or something like that, and someone's questioning that, I'll stop. But otherwise, I'll probably just run straight through and answer questions at the end. The other thing is, some of you may have got the PDF of the slides from the Palladino Power Project Facebook group. If not, they're under the handouts tab on your upper right hand corner box there. It says handouts. There is a link to PDFs and so forth. Lastly, the webinar will be put on YouTube down the line if you want to review it once again. And there, I believe Debbie typically puts links to articles that I mentioned in the webinar, so you'll find links there. And as I go through, I'll also provide the links on the slides, and as always, all the articles I write are in the file section of the Palladino Power Project Facebook group, so you can always go there to download the file for the article I'm mentioning. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. There we go. So if you don't know me, my background is as a runner when I was in undergraduate education, and there I got to a level where I ran 2:16 marathon, qualified for the 1980 U.S. Olympic Marathon Trials. I had about a 30-year career as a podiatrist where I specialized in surgery, sports medicine, lower extremity biomechanics. I'm now retired and coaching. I've been coaching exclusively by running power since August 2016, not long after Stride became available. I had a cycling career in racing bicycles for a while, and in my master's ages. And the bottom line is this: I have all this background, but I've been using power meters as well as WKO products since early 2000s. I adopted power about 2002, if I recall correctly. WKO became available not long after that, and I've been with it ever since. But of course, since about 2016, more on the running with power side. So I've got a little variety of perspectives. I want to start with this quote from Tim Cusick, who posted on the WKO for power users page. He wrote this: WKO4 is a robust physiologic model that's utilized for dose targeting and response tracking. And that is absolutely true, but one of the things that makes this model go is the testing component. So I view all three as three pillars for making this WKO power duration model work well, and that's what will be the focus of our discussion tonight. Is the protocols for testing. And if we look back in time, we looked at testing. Testing was primarily revolved around establishing FTP and CP. And in running circles, by and large, that's still the focus is finding your CP, establishing a training program based on CP, and evaluating with CP testing. Well, over time, we've also found that you can add to that FTP CP testing with other components. What's the 5K power, or what's the 5-minute power that gives you roughly VO2 max power? You can add those testing components, if desired, to enhance your knowledge of that individual. And that's one of the things we're going to emphasize tonight, is how to get testing to work with those other pillars to give you a really individualized approach. And where we're at now, or at least what's available to us, is the runner's entire power duration curve using the PDC model that WKO4 offers us. So by having that entire PDC, we can really target training appropriately and also evaluate responses. So we're going to be focusing on testing protocols, but also how to maximize testing protocols for the individual approach. And one of the other important aspects of my delivery tonight is I want to emphasize there's not just one right way. There's not just one test that you should do. There are many ways of approaching this. Alex Simmons, in a humorous way, put it in this terminology. Alex is my cycling coach back in the day when I was actually doing some good things in cycling, and he's an outstanding coach, and he's been with Power since the early 2000s. He's one of the founding fathers, so to speak. I'm going to cover a number of topics as we discuss testing protocols and arriving what works best for your runner at a specific point in time, what works best, and we're going to cover these 6 topic areas. I'll go into them one by one, but this is what we're going to cover. This is the scope of our coverage. And we're going to start with who. We need to know a little bit about the athlete that we're testing, in general terms as well as specific terms. And in general terms, keep in mind that when we're testing runners, particularly if we're testing triathletes, it's not the same as cyclists. Even that single triathlete, their cycling is going to be different than their running in terms of various physiologic metrics as well as the power metrics. For example, FTP as a percent of VO2 max is generally higher in runners than in cyclists. Balat shows in multiple studies that FTP or velocity at lactate threshold, or LT2, is around 84 to 87% of VO2 max, where in cyclists it's a lot lower than that, maybe 80 to 82%. So what that in turn means is that if a runner, let's say a runner is their FTP is at 87% of VO2 max, that means that when they're running 90% of VO2 max, they're around 103% of FTP, which is just a little bit higher intensity for most runners than 10K power. So keep that in mind, that FTP is a higher percentage, occurs at a higher percentage of VO2 max. Also, the VO2 max slow component, the slow component is if you have let's say you've established a power, let's say a power to achieve VO2 max in 4 minutes. Well, if you run a 8-minute interval at just under that power, you could still hit VO2 max or get your VO2 max by this slow component. Well, that's true in cyclists, but in runners, the slow component is far more feeble. Again, this is Balat's research, and basically, and Balat actually has an article about this where they found that if you, with runners running at 90% of VO2 max, they're able to achieve somewhat of a steady state, not access VO2 max, running at 90% of VO2 max. So when you're getting close to VO2 max, you're not going to necessarily drift up to VO2 max. And so for training purposes, you want to be closer to VO2 max when you're actually specifying training targets. FRC, functional reserve capacity, or the anaerobic side of things, is typically smaller in runners than cyclists. Efficiency is more variable in runners. If you, and this is as a population as well as within the runner. For example, runners are going to be more variable than cyclists in terms of metabolic efficiency. But also, if you take a cyclist and train them over time, their efficiency is not going to change that much. Where a runner, you train them over time, and their efficiency can actually grow. And so consequently, because it's more variable in runners, you have these other metrics that that come into play when analyzing runners, like running economy, running effectiveness. Another thing here is run FTP is not the same as cycling FTP. If they coincide, that's purely coincidental. They shouldn't necessarily coincide, but if they do, that's coincidental. And lastly, another difference between runners and cyclists is that running races are typically standard distances of 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon, etc. In general, they're more typically standard distances than our cycling races. So know these things in general as you're considering testing protocols, what you want to find out about that runner. But also, you want to know the athlete specifically. Some athletes have test anxiety, and CP test is, it's a really nice test for finding out FTP or CP, but test anxiety may ruin that test results and may undermine that test result. So you may go to something like time trials, spotting various spots of the power duration curve, or in my opinion, the best way of analyzing threshold power as well as other power metrics is have the athlete race. And Dr. Coggin has been saying for ages, the best predictor of performance is performance itself. So keep that in mind as you deal with an athlete. I have some that perform CP tests admirably, and I have others where it's been problem after problem, and in those I tend to go different directions, like just a one-off time trial or race. Another thing to know about that individual athlete is what's their target event. If their target event is a 10,000, then their primary power that's they're going to be utilizing for that 10,000 is in this range near FTP. But also in training them, you're going to want to know pretty accurately what the appropriate training targets are to the left or in the higher intensity range, as well as to the right in the lower intensity range. So you're going to support that specific power, race power, with training on both the high and low side of that race. And knowing what the athlete's target is will help you determine what part of this power duration curve, this entire power duration curve, do I really need to tighten up? Is it important to tighten up a 20-second power on an athlete that's training for a full marathon? Maybe not. It might be quite important if you're training somebody for 800, 1500, and that's sort of a prime support area for those races. So know the athlete's target event, and that's going to guide you to what parts of this power duration curve are going to be important to really have properly tested and really know what powers are the athlete's capable of in terms of generating training targets. All right, next, what are we training? So I'll start with physiologic underpinnings, and we often discuss, well, we're training at VO2 max, we're doing these VO2 max intervals, or we're training lactate threshold, we're training LT2. There's all of these. There's VLA max, which covers some of the anaerobic components, a 15-second test. There's VO2 max, maximal lactate steady state, ventilation threshold, lactate threshold, and then the lower LT and VT1s, which are down here. All of these things we want to know, as coaches, we want to know how these relate to the power. How are they related to the power targets? But I'll submit to you that those areas are not what we're training. What we're training is power. We want to maximize 40-minute power if for a person is targeting a 40-minute 10K. We're training power. These things are nice to know. It's nice to know the underpinnings, but that's not what we're training. Same thing with the energy system underpinnings. It's really important to know that for example, this athlete, for this specific athlete, we'll use this 5-minute. For their 5-minute maximal power, the blue line is anaerobic, green line is aerobic. They're getting about 11% of their production of that power anaerobically and 89% aerobically. It's important to know those things, and therefore it's important to know, their aerobic energy sources, whether it's fatty acid, primarily fatty acid, or glucose oxidative, glucose glycolytic, or the ATP creatine phosphate system. It's important to know those, but we're not necessarily specifically training those. We're training the power, but it's important for coaches to understand the underpinnings. And as I said, we're training power. And as we look at this, and let me explain this, the top one is a contributions chart to FTP. Again, anaerobic is the blue line, aerobic is the green line, and you can figure out by looking what percent aerobic or what percent anaerobic it is for that specific athlete to achieve this particular power, say at 5 minutes and 1 second. And you can slide it back along, and you can figure out what their threshold is, or their FTP, what the contributions are there versus contributions at 1 minute. This lower graphic here is from Dr. Coggin. It's based on cyclists. My suspicion and expectation is runners are not that much different in terms of variance. What it's looking at is the variability across a population. So this is the mean, and this is the standard deviation, or the variance, at that particular duration. So 10 seconds, there it is. 100 seconds is a little bit tighter. People are closer to the mean. And as you notice here that I have it boxed out, that when you're up here, somewhere in here, out to this longer duration, the variance is not that great. And around FTP, the variance is pretty tight. So interpret it this way. This is how I interpret it. FTP is a very important anchor point for a lot of training prescriptions, particularly in this range, because it will be applicable to that athlete, even if they're a high or low for that specific duration relative to the population. It's still pretty tight. You're going to be pretty well targeted if you use FTP in this range. But if you go to the left, you see with that variation, if you just prescribe based on FTP, you can be way off. You can be dealing with an athlete here or an athlete here and be way off on your training prescriptions. So we need something more to tidy up this portion of the power, individual power duration curve, so we can know specifically, should we be targeting here or targeting here? We know that if we test the athlete individually. So the other thing to notice about this particular box there, let's go back to the common racing distances from 800 to full marathon. These ovals, by the way, extend roughly from world record to the common age group. It spans pretty much that whole gamut for each one of these races. But if you look here, remember, not much variation here. So if you have the individual's FTP, then this area is going to be a reliable area to prescribe off of FTP. And basically runs from about half marathon, 5K to full marathon. Again, this comes from an article called "It's an Aerobic Sport, Damn It." That is the title of it. It's in the files section of Palladino Power Project. And basically, by looking at a lot of runners, even elites, 5K to marathon is generally will run between plus or minus 10% of the FTP. That's here to here, and that's that area again that does not have a lot of variance. So FTP continues to serve as a solid anchor point for training prescriptions. But as you get to the left side, you need help. And that's where designing your testing protocols may be very helpful for you and the athlete to come up with an ideal training plan. Why do we test? There's 4 things. There's a lot of reasons, but I've narrowed it down to 4 that I'd like to go over. The first one is we want to establish appropriate training targets. And primarily, in doing so, the underline the appropriate portion of that sentence, we want to be very individually targeted. And again, particularly testing that left-hand side of the power duration curve is important. In addition to establishing a good solid FTP, which encompasses a number of points on the power duration curve. We also want to utilize testing to monitor fitness progress. So we want to monitor FTP growth, or we may want to monitor 5-minute power growth, which is somewhat representative of VO2 max. We may want to monitor their 1600 meter power over time, but we want to monitor their fitness. But a sub text to that is that we also want to track responsiveness. We know that athletes respond to differing degrees to different types of training protocols. If you throw 7 times 15-second all-out sprint with full recovery at a group of 20 athletes, some of them might really improve and even show some improvements in VO2 max, but others, you might see them actually regress. So we use testing to see, did they respond to that training block that we just gave them? We throw a VO2 max training block at somebody. Well, we're going to test before that to know where their power duration curve is, but we're going to test after. Did this actually have a meaningful effect on the power duration curve in the durations that are specific for that training block we just applied to them? We also can identify areas of need. We look at the power duration curve. We look at the individual's mean maximal power curve, what they've actually done versus what the models say they're capable of doing. And if we see something where what they've actually done is lagging well below what the model predicts, that may indicate one of 2 things: that you haven't tested that yet, or it may indicate that you have tested it, but they need training in that particular area. So testing also helps us facilitate an individual approach by identifying areas of need. Lastly, for me, particularly in running, because of the standardized distances and so forth, that the testing allows for better race planning. If we have current fitness level, for example, CP or FTP, if we know that, it's going to facilitate planning a future race. Or if someone's had a recent race, it allows us to plan a future race. And in doing so, we are doing that individually, and we can level expectations. You can have athletes that really understand this is what I should be able to do, as opposed to, having the dreams of some pie in the sky PR that they're going to get. It allows them to know this is what you can do. Go out and do it, and have confidence in knowing that you can go out and do it. How are we going to test? Now, this is a big chunk of the talk, is the various protocols, and I want to present 5 different approaches. And again, not one single one is the right way. It's just consider these are arrows in your quiver in terms of how to approach testing a particular athlete. I'm going to go into these as such, and what we want to do is maybe take one or the other, or combinations of them, whatever works to get the best protocol for that individual at that point in time. So let's go through some of those variables. First is CP testing. CP testing, as I said at the outset, is sort of a standard in testing runners at this time, because it gives you a good marker for what FTP is. CP generally is within 1% or 2% of FTP, at least in my experience. If the test is well done, it's pretty representative of what FTP is. And for all practical purposes, if the testing is done properly, these are interchangeable terms. They're both representing the same physiologic state for the runner. So CP testing is an important component of testing runners, because again, going back to that slide I showed earlier, FTP plus or minus 10%, there's not a whole lot of variability from runner to runner. So FTP serves as a good anchor for setting training targets in that range. CP testing also can provide you with the runner's anaerobic work capacity, which gives you an idea of their relative anaerobic capacity. That can be helpful in knowledge of the training intensities you're prescribing on that left-hand side of the power duration curve. Someone with a higher anaerobic work capacity might tolerate slightly higher targets than someone with a really low anaerobic work capacity. This gives you just a general feel, but there's ways of getting more specific. This testing generally feeds the power duration curve at a couple points. If it's a 3-minute, 10-minute test, you're feeding the power duration curve with 2 good test areas, in the middle area of 3 minutes and then the longer area of 10 minutes. The power duration curve then in turn generates a MFTP or model FTP, and you could use the 2 to check how do they align. And I would say most of the time when I test somebody's CP, the WKO4 model FTP usually aligns within a couple % after you dump that test data into the model. Sometimes it's not, and when it's not, it allows you to start looking for what's missing. Why is there a discrepancy between the CP and the model FTP, and maybe I need to do some additional testing at different durations. As I mentioned at the outset, the FTP, when you generate a good estimate through CP, it's going to facilitate FTP-based prescriptions. And so it becomes fairly sufficient for 5K to full marathon training. Now, the cons of CP testing is that, again, test anxiety. Some people just can't execute a CP test properly, or they get too nervous and it's not the same as running a race. CP test is protocol dependent. I'm going to discuss that in a little bit, but it's also protocol dependent how accurate your CP value is. And then as you get into higher intensity training, less than 10K, particularly less than 5K, just knowing CP, just knowing FTP, it leaves you sort of guessing in that area of higher variability on the left-hand side of the power duration curve. The protocol that I typically advise is a good warm-up with some accelerations, some openers, so to speak, and then after the warm-up, recover. Then I typically will recommend a 3-minute test, and then later a 10-minute test. The 3-minute test is, this is exactly what I write in my training prescription. Run 3 minutes at maximal 3-minute effort, try to keep it as even as possible. If they have prior tests, they can sort of cheat and look at what their prior test number was and set that as their basement and just say, hey, I want to beat 324 watts that I did for my 3-minute test last time. The important thing, and a very important thing of CP testing, is that you want to get enough recovery between the two test components so that the fatigue created in that 3-minute test, for example, does not impair that performance in the 10-minute test. So I generally will advise runners to stop, walk, do whatever, sit down, recover, breathing fully. Then just a short little shakeout run, easy 5 to 10 minutes, and then stop and walk and recover again. And this should be at least 30 minutes. It could be longer if the runner chooses to have it longer. Whatever it takes, so it's not, this test is not impairing that test. So this is the standard. This is what I usually write in my test for CP check. I'm now calling them CP checks, not CP tests, just because test implies testing and anxiety and all that sort of thing. Some of the variations you might consider in your prescription of CP testing. One, you can vary the short component to somewhere between 2 and 4 minutes. The long component, well, actually, you could even extend that short component out to 5 minutes in some athletes. The long component, 10 to 20 minutes. One thing to keep in mind that there's some literature that suggests that when all of your test durations are less than 12 minutes, there's a tendency for the CP test to overestimate CP. So keep that in mind. When I have runners where doing a 15 or 20-minute test is not going to be overly difficult for them, I'll extend the 10 minutes out to 15 or 20. Examples would be more elite athletes or athletes that are really experienced doing the CP test and have a lot of training volume under their belt, so a 15-minute test is not going to be way out there for them. But for most athletes, it's 3 and 10. Calculation of the CP value, you can do it manually, and the formula is in this article, Understanding Applying CP Testing for Runners. There's the link. As I said, Debbie will probably provide the link on the YouTube channel, but also this article is in the article library in the file section of the Palladino Power Project Facebook group. So you can do it manually. You can create a spreadsheet using that formula, which I have, which I use occasionally. For example, let's say you don't want to do duration. Let's say you want to have the person do 800 meters and you want them to do a 3,200 meter test. Well, you can take the duration and the average power from the 800 meter test, the duration and the average power from the 3,200 meter test, plug it into this formula, whether it's manually or spreadsheet, and you're still going to get a good CP test if you prefer doing distances instead of durations. There is an online calculator also linked here in this article. The online article or calculator goes by durations, and it doesn't have a 12-minute duration, so don't prescribe 12 minutes unless you're going to use something spreadsheet or manual. So the calculator goes by durations, and it also gives you the anaerobic work capacity estimation as well. The recovery between test components is a variation. As I said, I prefer going longer. I wouldn't go anything shorter than 30 minutes. Then there's the issue of, do you do a short component before long component, or long component before short component? And let me just give you this impression. if you do the long component before the short component, let's say the athlete just blows that first one out of the water, just nails it, but they're fatigued from it and they underperform the short duration afterwards, that is going to result in an overestimated CP. On the other hand, if you have the short duration first, the long duration second, short duration, let's say they blow it out of the water, they nail it, but they leave themselves a little fatigued and they slightly underperform the long component, that's going to leave you with a slightly underestimated CP. Now, choose your poison. I personally would choose slightly underestimated over slightly overestimated. Slightly overestimated can lead to very challenging training targets as well as training load errors on the upside. So I'd rather have this format and err towards, well, I'd rather have a perfectly performed CP test, but if I had to take my druthers, I'll take slightly underestimated than overestimated. Let's see. Perfect. Oh, wait a minute. There was a question here. Let me just double check it. Oh, there's a question on an earlier slide. How can we establish a VT1 or ventilation threshold 1 from the PDC? I don't know. I don't know if there's a good way, and I really wish there was. That would allow us to really fine-tune our easy aerobic targets. But that was a good question, and believe me, I'm searching for the answer for that, but I don't have one for you this evening. If you're running a CP test, back to the slides again, if you're running a CP test and you're doing them on a repeated basis, you can actually compare over time, not just the person's power duration curve, but you can actually compare specific tests. This runner had two different tests, one in January, one in March. The second was at a more fatigued state based on TSB and the training, the CTL ramp rate, that's the RR there. So it's a little bit more fatigued, but nevertheless, they showed improvement here. And a lot of times when you see improvement from one test to the other, you go, well, is that just test variation, or is that real improvement? Well, I would guess that given that this second test was done under more fatigued state and still performed a bit higher, a little over 1% higher, that's probably a real change. The other thing I look at is some of these variables, and in particular, I'm really excited about this one. When the runner's power to ground contact ratio jumps like that, that's pretty nice. And when the person's ground contact time improves like that, that's not CP, those are other metrics, but it's still nice to be able to compare something that's somewhat standardized from one to the one date to the next date. Okay, let's try to get my slides back going. There we go. Another thing about CP testing to keep in mind is that the test doesn't have to be the end of the workout. Testing is training. The CP test alone, 3-minute test and the 10-minute test, that constitutes a very powerful VO2 max stimulus. Those are real, you're going all out for 3 minutes, all out for 10 minutes. VO2 max power, the time to exhaustion for that is somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes. So this is really giving good stimulus for VO2 max. But for athletes that are really well trained and have the capacity to do a little bit more, you could add a little bit of extra. And so in this case, I asked the runner to recover fully and then do a 10-minute, a 12-minute tempo at 94 to 96% of FTP, which is about half marathon power. And the interesting thing is this runner didn't take a whole lot of time to recover. You look at this, they did the walking, they did a little shakeout, they did the walking, so they got a nice 30-minute break in here. But after they're done with the 10-minute, they went into some shakeout running and then gradually ramped and got right into that tempo. So, you know, a testing day is also a training day, not just in the context of the 3-minute and 10-minute tests alone, but also other things that you could add on to in a runner that has that capacity. Another form of testing is racing. Racing is testing. And the beauty of racing is it generally gives you a maximal or near maximal effort, and it can give you an FTP estimate via the Rigel formula, which I'll get into in just a second. It also provides a good, solid data point that you're dropping in for the power duration curve, so it feeds it at that location. And it, besides giving you FTP, it also gives you a power duration for that race. So you now know, say, 5K power, or you now know 10K power. You now know half marathon power. So that could fine-tune your training prescriptions a little bit. So not only do you get this, the FTP, but you also get that race-specific power. One of the cons of using a race is that it really only feeds one portion of that power duration curve, but it is coming back to the pro, it is a very powerful data point that you're adding in because it's a maximal test. You can also use the FTP generated from the Rigel formula to check the MFTP. They should align pretty well. I'm going to give you some examples of that in just a second. If they don't align, then it's up to the coach to look back at that power duration curve and say, oh, maybe they need to be tested for 1 minute. They just did a 10K, but maybe next week we'll do a 1 minute test as well, just to tidy up that power duration curve. Because it generates a good FTP estimate, it facilitates FTP-based prescriptions. As I mentioned earlier, that's pretty solid for 5K to full marathon training. The other thing about a race, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, is that the race power can be utilized for estimating other races. So you can estimate race targets from FTP, but you can also estimate race targets from other races. So race is a very, very important part of testing. And so, whether it's an A race or a B race, it still is a very, very powerful data point into your power duration curve. This right here is the Rigel formula and how it's modified to arrive at FTP. There's also a calculator that I provide in this article, estimating FTP-CP from race power data. Again, there's the link. Again, it'll be on the YouTube channel link, as well as it's in the files section of the Palladino Power Project. There, in this article, it gives the formula. It gives some of the rationale for some of the choices in that formula, and it also gives you this. It gives you a calculator in that article. So the calculator is embedded, and all you have to do is put in the race time, the duration, the race average power. You need to put in a Rigel exponent, which is the tricky part, is coming up with that. I will often bracket an estimate, maybe a minus 0.07, minus 0.08. I did this for an athlete just the other day for 10K, and minus 0.07, minus 0.08 for that athlete gave me the exact same FTP estimate. So bracket it, and it gives you a ballpark, but a lot of times it'll give you a really nice tight ballpark for FTP estimate. So again, it's in that article. And now let's just go in through a few examples. This is all from the same athlete. It's emerging elite female. We're estimating to a 50-minute estimated duration, which I found works best, and a exponent of minus 0.05, which works very well for this athlete being an emerging elite runner. So using those variables, here are a few races. This was in June. 34:51, 10,000 meters. Average power was 242. You dump those numbers into the Rigel formula, and the estimate was 238 watts. As soon as you dump that power data into the model, the WKO4 model, MFTP estimate updated to 241 plus or minus 0.9 watts. That's within 1%. So what I'm trying to say here is that the Rigel formula generally agrees fairly well with the WKO4 MFTP estimate. This was before this one. This was in April, I believe, 1707 for 5,243 watts, generated a 230 watt FTP estimate from Rigel formula. The MFTP estimate was a 228 plus or minus 2.4 watts. So again, within 1%. Later on, October of the same year, 58:55 for 10 miles, average power 232. The Rigel formula 234 was the estimate for FTP, and the MFTP estimate with that data updated to 236 plus or minus 0.5 watts. So again, within 1%. So pretty nice and tidy. Racing is important, and whenever a runner races, I always go, besides looking at the power duration curve, what happened there, I always go back and calculated what the CP and FTP estimate is from that race data. So race is a very important component to include. Standard distances, well, you know, testing in running, this has been going on for a long time. You know, in the running community, they've had this nailed pretty well, where they test standard durations, or standard distances, I should say. And not that you're going to test everything from 200 meters to 10K, but you might, if a runner races a 5K, you might want to know their 1,600 meter power. So you might test them at 1,600 meters. You might want to know their 400 meter power, and might test them at 400 meters. So you can use standard distances, whether they be races or time trials, and whether they're at the same time or later, you can utilize those as a part of your protocol that you may develop for a runner. Now, keep in mind that if you choose multiple points, you're feeding the power duration curve at multiple locations, and that can be very powerful for making that power duration curve very tidy and valid. Furthermore, when you start testing some of the distances less than 5,000 meters, you start allowing yourself a little bit more individual prescription of training based on the information you gain from those test distances. If you're relying on standardized distances and you want to get a good FTP estimate and good power duration curve, you may have to test something more than 15 minutes. I rarely do testing more than 15 minutes. If it's more than 15 minutes, I say find yourself a 5K or find yourself a 10K, and that will more than adequately fill in that medium long portion of the power duration curve. And if you're doing durations, ideally you want to be on a track. So standard distances are another arrow in your quiver. And keep in mind, you don't want to necessarily test all of them, and certainly you don't want to throw a battery at a runner and say, well, you're going to do a 400 and a 1,600 and a 3,200 on Wednesday. No, you may have to split these up and do them on separate days. And that's the beauty of the WKO4 model, is that you don't have to test everything on the same day. You can spread it out over a 2-3 week period and keep in mind the power duration curve model is sort of tuned to 90 days worth of data. So really you can do an 800 meter, 800 and 200, and then come back a month later, do 400, 1600, and tidy up that end of the power duration curve. So there's a lot of different ways of testing standardized distances, but be aware that that's available, and there's a lot of different ways of utilizing standardized distances. And again, if you're training a middle distance runner, you're going to choose distances to test, maybe not in one single battery, but you're going to test some of these durations to tidy up your targets on that end. And if it's, say, a 10K runner or beyond, you don't necessarily have to test and know the runner's 800 meter power or 400 meter power by testing. These tests here, 1632, may be sufficient, and then maybe a race at 5K or 10K. Rather than do distances, I prefer durations. So same thing, same locations on the power duration curve, but you're testing durations rather than distances. This, again, it feeds the power duration curve at multiple locations, but the numbers that you're getting is more specific to duration-based prescriptions, and it really optimizes the training when you're training for races less than 20 minutes. You're really utilizing that part of the power duration curve on the left-hand side. One duration that you may consider including somewhat regularly, maybe every couple of months or so, is testing some standardized distance, whether it's a 5-minute test or 4-minute or 6-minute test, just to get some representative of VO2 max power, and just use the same duration each time you come back to that test. I'm not going to go into this. You can read the slide as well as I can. So again, when you're choosing these durations, you don't necessarily have to do all of them. Pick the ones that work best for you in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and choose a time period that works, whether it's same day. I'm going to have you do a 60-second and then a 10-minute test, something like that, or whether you do it on different days. Hey, I'm going to have you do a 20-minute test on one day or a 15-minute test on one day, and we'll come back a couple weeks later and do 60 seconds. There's a lot of variety that you can use depending on the runner's specific needs and your needs for prescribing. Again, same sort of thing. Middle distance runner, you want to get some solid testing in the lower, shorter durations, and 10K runner, you want to have some solid testing around 5 or 10 minutes at least, and then plus a 5K or 10K race. So those are sort of all arrows in your quiver, things that you can come back to. But now with the power duration curve, we have the capacity of doing selective power duration curve testing. So we don't have to test multiple points on one given day. We can look at the power duration curve and look at what does it need the most. Back in the day, we would look at, let me stop for a second. The model in this case is yellow, and the mean maximal power curve is red. That is opposite of all the charts that I use. The charts that I use, the power duration curve model is red and mean maximal power is yellow. So as I get into some of my other charts, and I apologize that I didn't change this around, but keep in mind that in most of my other charts, red is the model and yellow is the mean maximal power curve, what's actually been done. So back in the day, we would look and say, oh wow, this actual is below what the model is saying. So that's indicating A, I haven't tested there in a while, or B, that's an area that really needs some training focus. So that was the old days. Nowadays we have this. This is a William Renfro creation. Best times for informal testing is the name of it, and it's in the chart library for WKO4. If you're using it for running, you need to change the expressions to run power from bike power. Just make sure they say run power so this functions properly. But the beauty of this is it gives you a lot of specifics over here, but just visually, it tells you the percent deviation. So, for example, this is 5%, this is 10%. This particular point, this point is roughly, it's a little over 5% below what the model says the runner can be, and over here it's clearly over 5%. At the Pmax region, below what the model says the runner should be able to do. So this chart is integral in allowing you to selectively test the power duration curve. Meaning one time it might be that you need to test 1 minute. One time you might find that the 3-minute mark needs to be tested. Or you might look at another time and find that the 12 or 15-minute mark needs to be tested. So the beauty of this is that it's going to feed the power duration curve when you get a new test mean maximal, but it's going to feed it at the area that it's most needed in that power duration curve. That's key. It's most needed. So we're not wasting a test at 1 minute when we don't really need to test at 1 minute. We already have a reliable power duration curve there. So it's going to focus the areas that are most needed to tidy up that power duration curve. So it enables the prescription, therefore, on the entire power duration curve reliably, whether it's the left-hand side or the middle or the right-hand side. It tidies that up. And again, it obviates the need for a battery test. You just say, go out and do this one. Do a 3-minute test or do a 2.5-minute test. The main con of this approach, this particular arrow in your quiver, is that it facilitates whack-a-mole. You go ahead and you knock one down and you see that the deviation is fixed, but you notice, oh wow, there's a little one over here, and I need to go ahead and fix it. So we may knock this one down, and now this one's left behind, and we go, well, do we need to fix that? Maybe, maybe not. We'll discuss that in a second. So it facilitates whack-a-mole, and you have to avoid that. Just fix the parts that are most needed. I'm going to give you an example here. This is a case history. This is a runner who I had his FTP set at 340 based on a 10K race a month and a half prior. So he'd been training with targets based on a 340 watt FTP. However, the MFTP at this point in time was 332. So that's lower than what I've been training him at, and it's lower what his FTP was based on Rigel a month and a half ago. Why? Well, if just eyeballing, you can sort of see this area sort of lagging, where again, this is measured now. Yellow is measured, red is the model. It's lagging, and that may be a weight. It may be an anchor where it's holding that power duration model down in terms of estimating FTP, as well as some of these other power durations along the way. So this runner, we ran a race, and I was hoping that this B race we would get another estimate of FTP, and then when we dump that race data in, it would update the power duration curve, so things are aligned a little bit better. We don't have 340 estimated or set FTP, and 332 is what the model's saying. So the runner ran a 10K. The FTP estimate from that 10K came out to about 337. So it's closer to the prior 10K 340 than the 332. And when we dump that that data into the WKO4 model, when we added it to the database, this is what happened. Absolutely nothing. He still had a 332 watt FTP estimate. Nothing else changed. So that race did squat for updating and tidying up this power duration curve. So I go to this chart, the best times for informal testing, and I go, okay, let's look at that little lag area in closer detail, and I say, okay, here's 5%. I drew this line in here. You can see, yeah, that's pretty significant for this particular runner, and I think that's holding the whole thing down. So we're going to test, and I chose 3 minutes because what I found is that if we test at 3 minutes, usually that's going to improve. You're going to get some mean maximal powers shy of that as well. You could have easily done a 2 minute and 30-second test, or even come here and go, right around 2 minutes and tested that. Any one of those would have been fine. But I chose that I want to do a 3 minute test. Just go out. I want you to warm up really well. I want you to do a 3 minute max, and then we'll do some additional training. And you go, what about this? Well, this runner is training for a marathon, and I'm willing to have a P max value, a 2 seconds and less peak power. That's a little bit off. I do want this tidied up over here for a marathon trainer. Now, if I was testing or if I was training someone who's a 1,500 meter or 1,600 meter runner, I want that tidied up. So I would probably do a flying start 50 meter test, something of that nature, or a flying start 40 meter test. But not for this runner. All I want is just that one test. So this is the prescription. I go, you're going to do a 15K run. I want you to warm up. There's some accelerations here. I want you to do a 3 minute max full out right here. And then I want you to do some easy running, and then we're going to add some training to this. And you'll do a 20-minute tempo afterwards. So that was the training prescription. This is execution. You can see the runner. This was, I think, somebody crossing the bike path in front of them. So you go, oh no, is that going to mess that up? And it may have ultimately, but it functionally it did not. So this is after we dump that data into the database, and the model now corrects. It corrects it up, and let's look at what actually happened. So this is, I'm giving you pre-test and post-test. Pre-test is yellow, post-test is red. Let's get some of those lines out of there. This is what actually the mean maximal powers. So you can see in that 3 minute test, this is what it was before. This is pre-test. This is post-test. So he created new mean maximal powers from 3 minutes all the way down to 1 minute. All the way down to 1 minute. So he tidied up a whole big segment of his power duration curve. And this is what the power duration curve did. You can see that now the power duration curve increased the FTP estimate, and you even have nice improvements in prospective training targets from everywhere from FTP down to about 1 minute just by that one test. So we went from here to there. And again, do I chase this one? No. I'm satisfied that his race powers and the MFTP are aligning. I'm satisfied that we got a good power duration curve. Maybe I might chase that if I was training a 5K or less runner. I might chase that, but still, it's less than 5%. It's lagging less than 5%. I will after telling you that, I will admit that I did test them for 1 minute at a later date. There I am telling you to do something that I did differently, but you don't necessarily have to train this being only a little less than 5% below, or you don't have to test it. When do we test? there's a lot of times when testing would be appropriate. One is the beginning of a macrocycle. You're coming off of a rest, you're entering base period. That's a good time to test. When the runner's able to run and do a test at the beginning of a macrocycle. You could also test at the margins between mesocycles. Let's say you're doing a threshold period of 8 weeks, and then you test after that. You do a VO2 max period of 6 weeks, and you test after that. But the bottom line is you're going to want to test whenever there's a reasonable expectation of change, whether it's a positive change or a negative change. You might want to train after a training block where you expect an improvement. Or you might want to test after the person's had an illness or injury and now they've gotten back to their running. You want to reestablish what the proper training targets are. And in this case, it's probably less, but we want to establish what that is by testing. Person's going into a period of hotter weather. We know power is going to be suppressed in the heat. So we may want to train or test more specifically in warmer temperatures than in cooler temperatures to avoid that. I had a runner, just as an aside, I had a runner one time that I prescribed the CP test. It was warm weather, and I wanted to get a warm weather CP estimate. The runner replied, well, I did this early in the morning, so it was cool temperature, so I get a good CP. And I go, no, I'd rather get a hotter weather CP so I can give you better training targets. Another time I'll test is when there's expectation of change is altitude. Now, when I have runners go to altitude, I'll estimate their power differences just based on formulas of degradation of power at altitude. But after about 2 weeks, when they're settled in, it's probably time to get a more accurate testing at altitude. Another good time to test is if the runner is always, surpassing your power targets and saying those are easy. Those are really easy. That was really, or let's say you're telling them to do easy aerobic runs and they're going, I'm barely running at this particular target. You might consider that if they've moved and they're starting to tell you, hey, this is easy, that's a time to retest. Another time to test prior to a race, I will often test before an A race so I can really get good estimates for power targets for that A race. The time to test is sometime between 10 and 21 days. The reason is that CP testing or a battery of tests may be quite challenging, and doing that within in less than 10 days before an A race may be too taxing. They're already into their taper. So I bring it prior to 10 days. And if you go prior to 21 days, then fitness may change between, say, 28 days and the A race date. So I use 10 to 21 days as my general area for testing prior to an A race. Other things just to tidy in when to test. Testing is training. So if you're in doubt, it's also a good training exercise. And I'll do that if someone's on a program. Well, let's say we're doing a VO2 max workout every other week. It may be that, hey, it's time to test or getting time to test, and this is when their VO2 max workout would fall. So let's just change that up and do a CP test instead of the VO2 max intervals. Also keep in mind, racing is testing. So B race, strategically placed B race can be a very valuable point to testing. And lastly, the PDC model defaults to 90 days. So keep in mind that whatever that race or test that you did that 85 days ago, that's going to drop out. And is that going to screw up your PDC? You may consider doing testing to compensate for what's dropping out, what you expect to drop out at the 90-day mark. I'm going to continue the history on that same runner. So we're 2 weeks out from the marathon A race, and the PDC looks like so. And I want to get back up my estimate. I want to see if everything's aligning on that power duration curve, particularly FTP, which I'm going to use for predicting marathon power. So 11 days prior to the marathon A race, we do a 3:10 CP test. And then we also did a 15-minute tempo exercise here. CP comes out 340. So that gives me a pretty reliable number. With that 3:10 test, this is what we see. At 3 minutes, we improved a little bit. At 10 minutes, we improved a little bit. And we had a little dropout, 20-second power dropout. That dropped out of the power of the data, the 90-day database between before and after the test. So what that did is result in an MFTP updating to 339 plus or minus 1 watt. That aligns very well with the CP test. So I'm pretty confident in basing marathon power target estimates, which I'm supposed to do tonight, off of this 340 watt-ish CP slash FTP. So again, this is an example of when to test, and doing this was about 11 days. I'm just throwing this one in here. This is that best times chart, and we can see that all of the lagging points are relatively low. They're all well below 5%. So I'm pretty satisfied with that. His power duration curve is pretty accurate, and his MFTP is right around 340, and that gives me good data for estimating his race. The last bubble, so to speak, the last of the 6 points is where do we test? And I put this in here because you want to consider specificity as we're doing this. We want to consider the demands, the specific demands of upcoming training. So we want to be able to match our training targets to what's coming up in training. And so the testing should be somewhat specific. Examples. Let's say someone's going into winter training where they're going to be predominantly on the treadmill. You might want to consider doing some testing on the treadmill so that your targets are specific for the treadmill. Heat, I've already given that example. If you have a runner who's a trail runner, mountain runner, you might want to consider doing your testing in that environment. So where? Maybe not on a track. Is a good idea for a trail runner to test them out on the trails, at least on an area where they can really get a good maximum effort. We've already discussed altitude. So these are some examples of where you're going to test. You're going to modify your testing protocol based on the specific needs for upcoming training and racing. So I'm going to summarize, go back to several slides here just to wrap things up. First thing, remember that we have this great model, WKO power duration model. It allows us to do dose targeting and response tracking, but realize that testing is a very important driver of both of those components. So all three of these are really important components. So having a good testing approach is going to facilitate your individual training prescriptions and individual training assessments. And in deciding what's best for your runner at that point in time, so we got to consider that runner, that point in time, and the specifics for the upcoming training, like I just got through discussing. We want to understand all these various factors that go into selecting your specific protocol. And when you get to that point, realize that you've got a quiver with multiple arrows. There's not one way, just one way. There's multiple ways. And I gave you that case history where I gave you racing as testing, selective testing as an example, and even testing CP prior to going to the A race. So there's a lot of different quivers. Pick what's right for that individual at that point in time. and you're going to have a successful individual approach to training that runner. So I thank you, and keep in mind, as Alex Simmons says, there are many ways of accomplishing this task. So let me see if there's some questions here, and there's one that's from earlier. Do you solely use stride, or do you occasionally use run scribe or Garmin power? All the athletes that I've coached use stride. That is not to say that you cannot use run scribe or Garmin power in this manner that I've discussed in terms of testing and so forth. So it just so happens that I have not had an athlete yet that's using run scribe or Garmin power, or polar power for that matter. That's another one. Okay, there's another question. Let me see. Compare CP testing. Okay, so how do you align power and pace? There's an article I wrote on the pitfalls of converting power and pace. It does have a calculator in there, but running effectiveness is a key metric that allows you to convert power to pace. And when you do that, you can have the translation of one language of power to the other language of pace. You need that translator of running effectiveness. I have a calculator that's in that article, pitfalls of power to pace conversion. It's in the Facebook group page. Take a look at that, but the calculator is not going to be 100% accurate, as is explained in the article. How do you compare, would you compare CP testing to lactate and VO2 testing? CP aligns fairly well, as correlates very strongly with maximal lactate steady state, but as I mentioned earlier, it's important to understand the underpinnings, but I'm not training to improve the person's VO2 max or training to improve their LT2. I'm training to improve their 5-minute power. I'm training to improve their CP, their functional threshold power. Power is what I'm training them to do, because that's what they're going to utilize in the racing. So it's nice to understand the underpinnings. Like I said, 4 to 8 minute power is roughly equivalent to VO2 max, power at VO2 max. CP or FTP, roughly equivalent to maximal lactate steady state, which is it's a little bit lower, but pretty close to lactate threshold 2 or LT2. So it's important to understand those, but you're trading power, and that's what's critical here. All right, so I think that's it for the questions. If there are others, feel to hit me up on the Palladino Power Project Facebook group, and I wish you all well, and hopefully this works out well for you. Thank you.